that we are doing live. So I'm very happy about that, and I'm also very happy to do that with the team of LIEPP. So thanks LIEPP for having us here. So the opportunity was Rodney's new book, which is here, and which I strongly recommend. Our media ownership matters. So Rodney is doing the book too, and he told me that it would be like around France. So I guess Paris is one of the good places to have him. I'm going to present you like quickly. So you initially you come from sociology, even if you are like spending a lot of time with economists. So I guess this is one of the good things also to have you at LIEPP, which is an interdisciplinary laboratory. You had a PhD from Berkeley. You taught in France at some point. You are living in Paris. We are not going to ask you to speak French, but I know that you know good French. And then you're a professor of media at the university, at the New York University. Specialist of media, media competition, media ownership. In fact, according to me, you are one of the best specialists of French media, even if a lot of what you do is a comparative way. I do like a lot your previous book. I should have taken some note on shipping immigration news. That was a lot about France with a comparative approach. Here you have some France, you have UK, you have the US, you have more than that. And this is something that is very interesting because it's always a mix of something that is kind of qualitative. You spend time like doing interviews and like much more quantitative. So we do learn a lot in all your different books, and I'm very glad to have you like today presenting this new one. I also want to thank Anya Schiffrin for accepting to discuss the book. There were various reasons why we wanted Anya to join. First of all, because Anya is a very good specialist of media, and in particular of the issues linked to media ownership and to bad media ownership. She's a professor at Columbia University, and one of the other reasons, even if we thought about inviting Anya before that, is that she did a very good interview about the book with Rodney in the Columbia Journalism Review a couple of weeks ago. So first, I recommend you to read the book and then to read Anya's interview. So Rodney, like the floor will be yours for like 30-45 minutes, whatever you want. Then Anya is going to discuss your presentation, and this will also be a way to introduce the discussion. And we have like altogether like 1 hour and a half until 5:30, and then we have some drinks and food. I don't know whether this is in this room or somewhere else.
It's gonna be downstairs.
So
I'm gonna guide you all.
Food and drinks we are going to follow Felipe, as always. And thanks like Felipe from the Econ department and Tessa from the CEPR and like all the LIEPP organizing team for organizing this event. So,
thank you. Thank you, Julia. And I've been following Julia's work for many years, and I think Anya might have been the one who actually introduced us originally. So Anya is a real leading scholar of media capture, and he's also like the kind of cross-disciplinary networker extraordinaire. So she knows everyone, and she connects everyone. And so I'm so happy she can join us as well today, because she and I have been in a dialogue about this book, and it's been great. It's true, I've started to give a few talks about this book, but a lot of them have been with economists. I don't know why that is. I was telling Julia, I was just at the Norwegian School of Economics in Bergen, and that was it was a conference on competition. And then actually one of the organizers, Telef Rob, had been working there, but then he got his PhD in Cambridge with John Thompson. So he was kind of a bridge there between sociology and economics. So I definitely, I don't know if it's, I think it's two-way with some economists, certainly Julia, but sometimes maybe it's more the sociologist reading economists than vice versa. But I love Julia's work, Matthew Genskow, Andrea Pratt. So it's been very useful to me, and I love the kind of deep empirical research and the insights that economists can provide. So I want to build on that. So what can I add as a sociologist? I think that sociologist, I'd like to say that we pay close attention to inequalities, social stratification, non-market dimensions of social life. And I think we also pay close attention to the civic consequences of market mechanisms and market failure. Julie's work definitely pays attention to that as well, but I don't know if that's true for all mainstream economists. So I think the dialogue is helping to bring those together. So I want to start by talking about two of the dominant ways of talking about ownership in public discourse today. And one of the, I hope, contributions to this book is a way of conceptualizing ownership, right? Not just to carry out systematic research, which we've done, but how to think about ownership. Okay, so two kind of dominant ways that people tend to talk about media ownership in the public discourse, I think in France as well as the US and Sweden. One is, it's basically about individual media moguls, right? It's very personalized. It's very, it's like celebrity news about billionaires. They own the media. So Jeff Bezos, he's selling out the Washington Post. Benson here is obviously constantly in the news. Elon Musk, and so it's all about how they're using their media outlets to promote their political or economic interests. And I'll talk about that. I mean, yes, but I think we need to go deeper than a kind of anecdotal, personalized approach to understanding. Murdoch is another one. We want to know everything about his private life. But I wanted to contextualize that in a larger framework today. The other way we talk about media ownership is a very structural way, very macro structural way, right? That talks about media concentration. So it's data on market shares, how many firms control X percentage of the market, right? And that's very useful as well, too. But that in some ways goes to the other extreme. It kind of gives us this kind of big data, but doesn't really help us sort out the variation across different types of ownership, right? So to give you an example, Ellie Noam, an economist at Columbia, led a project that I think they finished their work in the mid-2010s. And they looked at the 30 countries with the largest media markets in the world. So this was not just, the global north, this was several countries in South America, Asia, the 30 largest media that account for maybe about 90% of revenues of media in the world. And they looked at the concentration. They had lots of different indicators. I'll just show two of these because they look at not just news media, but all kinds of media. So news media by attention and news media by revenues. And the US, where I know you have this debate here too, but the US where Ben Bagdickian wrote about the media monopoly many years ago, and so one of the early pioneers in thinking about that. The US actually shows up in this study clearly as the least concentrated news media market in the world. This is pretty shocking. This is really shocking to me. I mean, it's, it doesn't mean it's not concentrated, but relatively speaking, it's not the most concentrated media market in the world. France and Sweden are actually kind of in the middle there. So what does that tell you? I mean, it's interesting, but I think, to really understand what's going on and also maybe what differentiates the US and other countries is to look at the forms of ownership. And so this is just data we gathered looking at the media outlets with the top 5 websites in France, Sweden, and the US. And when you look at that, you see this is from, I think, 2020. When you look at that, you see something that's really interesting. The US may be less concentrated in terms of firms, total firm concentration, but in terms of the dominant forms, all the top owners in, at least these top 5 in the US are stock market traded widely held, or stock market traded with a dominant shareholder. Whereas in France and Sweden, they're spread out more over these multiple kinds of ownership. And I'll talk more about what I mean by these ownership forms. That's not to say everything's hunky-dory here in France, but I mean, just to say that if you really want to understand what's going on, you can't just look at the individual media moguls. You can't just look at the market concentration. You have to look at the ownership forms. Okay. So how do we do this? For me, it really goes back to James Curran, who is a very prominent British media sociologist. And he came up with this little chart here, very kind of British, the public media is at the center of it, the BBC. But he said, really to have a strong democracy, you need to have this kind of multi-sectoral system where, each kind of supplements what the others are able to offer. So you surrounding that public service TV, you have what do you call civic associational. So this is somewhat similar to where I'm going, but and it certainly inspired me, but not exactly the same. So civic associational, professional, journalist controlled, private enterprise, and what he calls social market media, which he defined as smaller private media, partially supported by the state to promote competition and consumer choice. And I think that might also relate to the justification for subsidies, press subsidies, and for pluralism in France and Sweden, countries like that. So private media, but supported by the state to promote pluralism. Curran, in turn, was very influential for C. Edwin Baker. I don't know if you know his works, but Media Markets and Democracy, one of his famous books. He wrote a book on media ownership or concentration. But before those books, or around the time those books, the first book came out, but he was at Harvard, he was at the Shorenstein Center, and he wrote a policy paper where he looked at kind of all the research on ownership up to that point, and analyzed that. And a lot of that research basically came to the conclusion it was only really focused on chains, big chain owners versus independent newspapers, right? So are you part of a larger chain, or are you independently owned? And actually a lot of that research was inconclusive. It was like, maybe there's not that much difference. It doesn't necessarily. So for example, like Hearst is a privately held company that's a chain, right? Are the Hearst newspapers worse than the local family that owns? Not necessarily, right? And he said, that doesn't mean ownership doesn't matter. The problem is you have an incorporated variation in ownership forms, where you have ownership forms driven by different principles, right? Different logics, right? And he said to really answer the question of how ownership matters, he said you have to explore whether things like worker ownership or nonprofit foundation ownership or public ownership, as well as, and he used the word, various non-ownership mechanisms of control within privately owned media. Would these be more oriented towards public service, right? So you had to have a broader lens. And at that time in the US 90s, there was, recently there has been a kind of massive growth of nonprofit alternative. There wasn't at that time. And I want to get back to this non-ownership mechanisms of control, because I think that's what I really admire about what Julia's doing and what's going on in France, is journalist associations, charters, ethical charters, inside newsrooms as a way to limit the owner control. That's something structural that's going on in France that has not taken hold yet as much in the US. So he said we need to look at all these things. And in a subsequent book, Baker added, an ideal media realm will be pluralist in the types of media entities that it supports. Policy should encourage their operation on the basis of different principles, right? So these words of Baker's, these different principles, honestly have been ringing in my ears for the past 20 years. And have really kind of motivated this book, but even previous work, to try to think about what are the different kinds of media that will kind of expand the offering in a substantive way, in normatively consequential ways. So, but the fact is that very few researchers have systematically taken up this question empirically to kind of try to organize research to compare these different ownership principles. Media economics scholars Robert Picard and Aldo von Wiesel, in one paper, I think in around 2008, they offered an early assessment of different ownership forms, but they concluded that, and they didn't really have a systematic empirical research, but they concluded, they famously concluded there is good and bad performance under all forms of ownership, right? Okay, probably, yeah. I wouldn't entirely disagree, and we can talk about this in the questions. There are some interesting contradictions, right, within commercial media that we need to study further. But the question is, are there tendencies? Are there patterns? So I think the time has come to go beyond the anecdotal and to really look to do systematic research. So over the past decade, I've worked with a talented team of scholars, Mattias Hesserus in Sweden from the Axel Johnson Foundation, Tim Neff from Leicester University in the UK, formerly worked with me at NYU, and Julie Siddell, whom you may know from the University of Strasbourg, author of two important books on media directors in France. This was the team, and we conducted new research and reanalyzed old research to figure out literally if and how media ownership matters. So how media ownership matters is the fruit of this international collaborative research. Why these three countries? The US, Sweden, if you're familiar with Dan Hallen and Paolo Mancini's book, Comparing Media Systems, they argue that there's three broad Western media systems that capture different relationships between the market and the state. And they argue there's a democratic corporatist of Northern Europe, the polarized pluralist. France is sort of in between, right? So Spain, Italy, Greece would be even stronger examples of that polarized pluralist, and the so-called liberal, as in market-driven, market-oriented model of the United States and some of the other Anglo-Saxon countries, as we say, right? So, so to the extent that we find similar patterns across three countries, with different systems in many ways, then our claims to generalizability are going to be stronger, right? The other thing that's interesting about this, doing this kind of multi-country research, is that it really expands the imaginary of what's possible, of thinking about what is even possible in terms of ownership. Today I may, maybe not, but I might tell you some things about the US media that you didn't realize, right? I certainly have learned a lot from trying to understand France, because there's just some ways of doing things that exist in one country that really haven't even occurred to people in these other countries. So by looking at multiple countries, you see that the possibilities are beyond what you might have thought if you stayed in your own country. Okay, so the research consisted of, and I can come back to any of these methodological questions. We conducted more than 100 in-depth interviews of news executives and editors, starting in the early 2010s through, I think I did the last interview I did was probably in 2023. So all the way up to publication. We gathered or created extensive original data sets for media outlet funding, primary funding, audiences, the demographics of the audience, the political preferences, leaning of the audience, shareholders, boards of directors, and we conducted large-scale systematic content analysis of news and opinion articles in more than 50 news outlets, looking at their online websites, right? Okay. But in order to conduct this empirical research, we also had to carefully construct our categories of analysis. What might be these different principles that Baker is referring to? Lack of clarity about these principles, I think, has held research back in the past. For example, many researchers have referred to quote unquote corporate ownership, picking up on the language of Noam Chomsky and Edward Herman. But corporations are not all the same. They can be stock market traded, with or without a dominant shareholder. They can be privately held, and these distinctions may matter. Beyond this broad category of corporate, there are multiple specific legal forms that can also differ across country. And Julia Cagé and Benoit Huet did a magnificent job of identifying and explaining the numerous legal types of ownership in France. And I really love that book. But how can we make this sense of this complexity for multi-country research? We need some categories that allow us to kind of aggregate types, hopefully without doing too much violence to the specificities of each country, that allow us to compare across countries and aggregate the data. In previous papers and in the book, I argue that the way forward is through the institutional logics theory, first developed by sociologists Roger Friedland and Robert Alford, and further developed by Patricia Thornton and other organizational scholars. It's a kind of cousin to field theory, I guess I would say, to Bourdieu's field theory. Institutional logics is a theory of pluralism. It's a theory that insists that the social world, in some ways like Bourdieu, consists of these multiple, partially contradictory modes of understanding and acting in the world. It depicts society as more complex than, say, a totalizing theory of neoliberalism that insists that there's kind of a singular logic that shapes all human action, or even Bourdieu's sometimes binary opposition between an autonomous cultural pole and a heteronomous economic pole. An institutional logics approach tries to understand how different ownership forms materially and symbolically embodying different values and incentive structures. How do they add something new and different to the journalistic field? The focus then becomes not on how the field, to use Bourdieu's terms, how the field refracts heteronymous influences, but rather the specific logics of these heteronymous influences that are introduced into the field, right? So often, I think to kind of think about how ownership can be, and to think about power, drawing on my NYU colleague Stephen Luke's work, writings on power, to think about power is not just, is one way to think about power is as domination, right? And that's definitely something that's going on. But power is also productive, right? It produces things, it enables things, right? And so if we think about heteronymous or external pressures, owners only as something negative that comes into journalism, as opposed to something Raymond Williams has talked about this in his sociology of culture, that journalism and cultural, all kinds of cultural production have always been sponsored in some way. It always has to be funded and supported. And the question is, you know, what are the costs and the benefits of those arrangements? And they're not necessarily always negative. Okay. So the four types of ownership that we talk about in the book, the broad, which are linked to these institutional logics, are market ownership, private, civil society, and public. And so some of these draw on vernacular terms that we also use. Some of them try to kind of create an analytical term that's not necessarily the term, everyday term we use. So market ownership refers to any owner primarily subject to a short-term profit maximizing logic. So chiefly stock market traded and private equity hedge fund ownership. Market logic is marked by two broad principles: maximization of shareholder value and cost cutting. And so these quotes from our interviews, Julie Siddell's interview with Patrick Lilley at TF1, you know, he embodies the logic. He thinks of himself as a CEO embodied. He says, I was listed on the stock exchange. I had the analyst meeting, the general shareholders meeting. They're the ones that judge me. Actually, he's a little too modest there. He says his first obligation was to make money. I mean, it's not just to make money; it's to maximize profits compared to all the other possible uses that investors could put their money to use. And that is a key distinction, really. And the other aspect, the logic of market ownership tends to be cost cutting, constant cost cutting. And this was an interview I did with Jan Helen, who was at the time the director of Aftonbladet, which is the largest newspaper in Sweden. And then interesting trajectory. Then he went on to head public. He's one of the directors of public television in Sweden. But he was trying to get Schibsted to, which was making a lot of money for Blocket, which is a kind of Craigslist, right? They were able to kind of keep the classified advertising in-house, right? As opposed to losing it to another company. Why not take some of the profits you're making from Blocket and invest them in the newsroom, right? But they wouldn't do that. And they wouldn't do that not because they didn't care at all about the journalism, but because the kind of maximization of profit logic, forced them to, they couldn't divert that money from a profit-making part to a lesser profit-making part without risking lowering the shareholder price, right? Neil Fligstein, one of my mentors at Berkeley, has written about this, that market ownership, why is it all about cost cutting? That has become a signal to investors that you are serious, If you lay off people, right, your share prices almost always go up, because that shows that the management is going to take that, they're going to take that money they're saving on salaries, and they're going to move that money into corporate profitability. So these kinds of cuts have to happen constantly. And in the US, the convention is that there's quarterly reports every 3 months. There's reports every 3 months where the CEOs have to account for the profit they've been making. So it's a very short-term logic. I know that some countries in Europe have maybe 6-month timeline, so that in some ways, maybe stock market ownership because of that is less short-term driven than it is in the US. But in the US, because of that, very short-term driven, and owners like Gannett, which is one of the largest I think the largest owner of local newspapers in the US, is they've decimated their newsrooms. They've closed newsrooms. They've cut more than half of the journalists over the past decade, right? So, and they do that not because they're losing money, but because they need to maintain 15 to 20% profits. They need to maintain high profits, right? So they're not losing money, but they're cutting to maintain high profits. There's also an effect on news content. For example, and you can see this when there's a change in ownership. When BuzzFeed was privately held, it could invest in in-depth investigative reporting. It launched BuzzFeed News, right? Which did some interesting work. It attracted young people in a way that other news media were not able to do. But as soon as BuzzFeed listed itself on the stock market, everything changed. They cut the newsroom. They shifted the focus of the news coverage to celebrity news, to breaking news. No more investigative reporting. That wasn't attracting the eyeballs. And eventually, within a year or two, they closed it down entirely. I do not believe there's a BuzzFeed News anymore. So, that's the logic. That's the market logic. Private equity in the US, my sense is it's not become as big of a deal here. Private equity in the US is also a major owner. This is where the terms matter. It says it's private, but I would say it's not private ownership it's very much in that kind of market logic, market maximization logic. And these have also they don't have that same necessarily public reporting requirement every 3 months, but people invest in private equity, people invest in hedge funds for maximum profits. And that's what they get. They're often called vulture capitalists. Okay, so there are variations when there is when you have a dominant shareholder, and I know this is probably tends to be more common in France, where when you have stock market traded companies, in most cases you have a dominant shareholder, controlling shareholder. This is the case in some cases in the US and in some cases not. For example, Disney, which owns ABC, does not have a controlling shareholder, right? Whereas the Ellisons, who've just bought CBS, et cetera, they are the controlling shareholder. The New York Times company, you may not know, is a stock market traded company, right? And the Sulzberger family is a controlling shareholder. So that gives them, if they're willing to kind of forego the profits of the family that controls the voting shares, they can invest in the long term. And that's why we've seen what happens at the New York Times. They really did take a long-term approach and a very different approach to journalism than other stock market traded companies. But just because you're a dominant shareholder doesn't mean that you're going to decide to invest in quality news. So you have, here's another dominant shareholder, Rupert Murdoch, right? And he's taken a very different approach to his investment. So not all dominant shareholders are the same. They not all make the choice to defend and invest in quality or even factual news, as you've also seen firsthand in France. Okay, so that's market ownership and some different varieties of market ownership. Private ownership is distinguished from market ownership in at least two ways. First, it's usually a more concentrated form of ownership, residing either with an individual, a family, or a small group of investors. And second, although it aspires to generate positive net revenues to support operations, private owners have no obligation to maximize shareholder value. And thus they have greater discretion to balance their profit targets and timelines with other goals. Private ownership is often linked to family ownership, but it could also include employee ownership as well as startups in which individual founders might be supported with venture capital, for instance. And venture capital, that's a very interesting question because when you think about how do you categorize this, venture capital, some people might lump that together with private equity, but I think it tends to have a very different logic. And so bringing it back to what are the principles that underlies that ownership form, right? So with venture capital, usually you have a very long runway, 10 years or more. And during that time period, you can do some really interesting work. So I mentioned BuzzFeed. So BuzzFeed was a venture capital supported fund for over 10 years, was able to experiment and do a lot of interesting things. You could say the same thing at Vice, which is kind of collapsed now, HuffPost, right? These were all, especially during the early years with venture capital support. HuffPost is now part of a stock market traded company with BuzzFeed. So private ownership can be taken in very different directions. This is because, let's see. Yes, no. I guess I don't have the slide I thought I had. I was going to show Bezos and Musk again, right? So Bezos and Musk are, private owners, and they can, so I think, that's one way that we can begin to make the personal more structural, right? It's not just Bezos and Musk doing whatever they want because they're good or bad people. It's because they have established private ownership of their outlets where they control it completely. Jeff Bezos personally, through a holding company, controls the Washington Post. Musk controls X, right? And so that The Economist, this is a term where I get from The Economist, amenity potential, right? Media has an amenity potential that other kinds of, I don't know, if you own a food company, you don't maybe have that, but it has this kind of potential. Even if you're not making money, you can use it for other purposes, right? You can use it to promote political causes you care about. You can use it to promote your business interests, and so that it might pay off. And that was certainly the case with the Washington Post. For many years, it was not making money for Bezos, but he has used it other ways. Okay, so civil society refers to this associational and organizational sector that operates between the market and the state. Civil society ownership thus encompasses a range of distinct, and this is where I think institutional logic really becomes useful. It's not so much a single logic, but I think really a collection of institutional logics. It would include I would include professional logic of journalists, where journalists found outlets where all the profits are put back into the operation as a Mediapart, or Mediapart eventually became owned by an endowment. Other nonprofits, religious organization owned outlets like La Croix in France, like Christian Science Monitor in the US, and a kind of community logic which could incorporate partisan or labor union or foundations. And so there's a kind of, they're united by this distance from profit pressures. They have strong mission orientations. They might have different mission orientations. And they really are an important way to bring in different principles and different institutional logics in the field. Okay. And finally, public ranges from the way we use it, a more democratic state bureaucratic logic in most Western countries, to a non-democratic state bureaucratic logic in authoritarian nation states. So there's that continuum. Public media, by definition, have strong civic missions, but their ability to deliver on that mission varies, I think, in two ways. One is their level of funding, and two is the extent of their arm's length relationship to the state and to their protection from political interference. And across the world in recent years, we've seen erosion of both funding and legal protections from partisan interference. And we saw a dramatic example of that in the US, where the public funding was completely cut, right? This was in a situation where there was philanthropic funding, as you get in some civil society outlets. So they're not completely closed down, but massive amount of more than $500 million were cut from their budgets, right? Okay, so these four ownership forms, one way to think about them, and this is I think kind of Bourdieuian field approach, would say, hey, we can look at these ownership forms as a kind of continuum from the more market-driven to the less market-driven, right? And you could sort of see that from the market to the private to civil society and public. And that kind of captures Bourdieu's understanding of the journalistic field that's constructed between this opposition between a less market-driven autonomous pole and a more market-driven heteronymous pole. And I think this captures part of what's going on, but it's only part, right? Because certainly, and especially, I think the diversity of practices in this civil society space cannot be chalked up just to their their less commercial character. They are bringing in different principles, and I want to make that concrete by showing a few examples. Okay. So to look at the kind of religious, what does it mean when a religious organization, the Catholic Church or the Christian Science Church in the US, when they're the owner? And I've interviewed many journalists there and editors. The Christian Science Monitor, which you may not be familiar with, but is very well respected and is not considered a kind of propaganda arm of the Christian Church, Christian Science Church. It was founded in the early 20th century in kind of the era of the yellow press, really to embody the slogan of the founder, Mary Baker Eddy, that it should injure no man but bless all mankind. And so how do they do that? Very contextualized, in-depth reporting, what we call solutions-oriented reporting today. They've always been a leader in international reporting. So they have a very cosmopolitan outlook. And so I think, they're joining a religious logic, a particular religious logic, to journalistic professional logic. And it's not alien to the journalistic field in the US. They're very much accepted as mainstream players in that field. And yet it's what they're doing is really would not be possible if they were not owned by the Christian Science Church, which supports that and has subsidized that in a way that they don't have to worry about market pressure. So basically, more than half of their revenues come from church subsidies, right? And so that has been a key part. I think we could analyze La Croix and maybe look at some similar but distinct dynamics. News outlets owned by political parties, social movements, trade unions, major trade union support for some of the outlets in Sweden, historic party support for newspapers like L'Humanité, even if it's not so direct now, that they're joining a kind of partisan commitment to information, to a pluralist conception of news, right? So we know that they may be advocates in a way, but also they're bringing in new voices. They're making sure, new voices are in the news. And so we see that also at, you may not be familiar with these names, but Barometern and Norway. There's a lot of foundation-owned newspapers in Sweden that were originally owned by political parties. And the parties in mid-century shifted, they sold out to these foundations, but the foundations' purpose is very different from the US nonprofit foundations that support journalism. They are linked to political parties. And so their mission is to kind of support a particular party editorial line, mainly in their opinion pages, right? But they're linked to political parties. And finally, in the case of US foundation-funded nonprofits, you have a kind of philanthropic funding that is really focused with policy or social impact change, and so much that they really don't care about how big the audience is. And they certainly don't care about profits because they're completely nonprofits. And so you get this is where I think you get some dramatically different kinds of journalistic practices that are not antithetical to mainstream practices, but are pushing some public service aspects even further. So they're not worried about breaking news, right? So they're doing more in-depth news. They don't compete, actually. They collaborate, right? So ProPublica is one of the biggest in the US. They collaborate with the New York Times. They collaborate with other leading Washington Post and other leading commercial media. And they can really say, we're going to specialize. We're going to specialize in investigative reporting, or we're going to specialize in prisoner rights or immigration issues or education, right? And that's enabled by the ownership form and the funding that goes with that in the US. And I can't express this better than in one of my interviews with Chuck Lewis, who was really one of the founders of nonprofit news in the US, going back to the 1990s. And I kept asking him about, what do you know about your audience? And what do you think about your audience? And he was kind of avoiding the question. And he finally said, look, I just want to investigate the bastards, whoever they are. And I want to do good stuff. And I want to win awards. And I want the funders to think it's cool and support it, right? Right. So this is really a different principle of journalism, right? And it's enabled by that ownership form and that funding form. Okay, so I have to sort of just pause for a moment because Michael Schudson, a very important sociologist and historian of journalism in the US, always devil's advocate, once remarked, he says, ownership is important, but ownership is not everything, right? So, and he's right. And I'll just focus on two aspects that often are put forward as kind of alternatives to talking about ownership, sometimes by economists. Audiences and funding. It's not really owners that matter, it's the audiences, right? They're giving audiences what they want. And so, Matthew Genskow did a famous study, and I'll talk about that in a moment, which was, massive study and very impressive. But his main conclusion was, the data kind of shows that at the end of the day, the news content tracks closer to the audiences than it does to the owner's political preferences, right? But I have a problem with kind of like separating these, I think, it came out in our interviews when you talk to the news executives and the editors and how they think about what they do. They're talking about the audience. They're like thinking about how do we produce something that will reach our audience. So the owners and their managers are not thinking about, they are cultivating an audience. They are trying to target an audience, and that's a big part of what they do. And they're also thinking about funding models. And so like Edwin Pennell talking about only our readers can buy us. This is something that, thinking about audiences and thinking about funding are key aspects of what owners do and what ownership forms do. So, and I'm just about wrapped up in the model, and I want to give some of the key takeaways and the findings. So I think it's important to think about how ownership works. We should look at these ownership forms and then see how that relates to what you can call funding audience adjustment strategies. So different funding models, whether it's advertising, paying audiences, subscribers, philanthropy, or public funding are the main types of funding. And then what kind of audience are you trying to reach? Very broadly, a broad audience or a more elite audience. And we can break that down further. So to review so far, I've argued, let's see. I've argued that, well, let me, oh yeah. So, sorry. Okay, so we can see this in these ownership complex. We look at, here's the stock market, just looking at the stock market version of market, private, civil society, and public. We can see that different kinds of funding tend to group together with different types of ownership forms, right? There's some variation here and different types of audiences. So market media rely most on advertising. Private and to a slightly lesser extent, civil society rely most on audience subscriptions. Civil society media, especially in the US, rely most on philanthropy, and public media, of course, rely most on taxpayer public funding. What's interesting is we see a slightly different pattern for audiences. The two forms of ownership that we think of maybe as completely opposite, public media and stock market owned media, tend to be the media that reach large omnibus audiences. And the private and the civil society media, more and more tend to reach more niche elite audiences. And this is something that's important to think about when we're thinking about media plurality, not just what a media outlet brings into the field, but who it's reaching, right? Right. It might be doing really excellent work, but who is it actually reaching? Okay. Yes.
One clarification. So there is never advertising for civil society?
This is no, this is just means so this is just showing what is the primary funding.
Okay, this is
like what is the largest source of funding. So and if you want to get into the weeds of the book, we have on the online appendix, we would break that out of all the sources of funding.
Okay, no, sorry, I thought it was the graph with the share.
Yeah, so the graph just the share.
So you see the share of firms and not the share of
share of outlets that have primary funding of that type.
I was mixing the different.
No, I'm sorry about that.
Yeah, no, that's okay. That's sorry.
Yeah. Okay, so I've been focusing on to answer the question how ownership matters. One is it matters in terms of ownership forms and these funding audience adjustment models, right? I'm saying, if we want to think about how it matters in that way. But it also matters, I think the other way to answer that question is how does it matter in terms of the outcomes, the consequences, right? And so that's where we bring in the content analysis and analyze 3 modes of power or civically consequential outcomes One is the public service orientation of the news that's produced. Both the kind of information and how pluralistic the news is, the voices and viewpoints that appear. Second is political instrumentalism, the partisanship, how intensely partisan it is and leading in what direction. And third is economic instrumentalism, which is does this ownership form, does this owner promote its own economic interest, use that, right? And so these are analytically separate. And so to go back to that earlier phrase I said about, good and bad performance, it's important to sort of break that down. There's at least three kinds of performance there, right? And you might be good in two and bad in one, you might be bad in all three, right? So I think a nuance is like good in what way, bad in what way, right? I think it's important to do that. Okay, this is, if I can do this quickly, because I'm going to show some graphs that basically show scales. So in order to kind of take the 3-country data and not confuse cross-national comparisons with cross-ownership comparisons, when we do the content analysis for every news outlet, we're only comparing it to other outlets in the same country, right? We're only comparing it to other outlets in the same country. So that produces a kind of scale, whereas let's say you have 20% of your stories are investigative stories, which would be super high, right? But let's say that puts you well above the mean for your country, right? Or you have, whatever. So whatever you have is turned into the scale that's a 1 to 4 scale from, are you well below the national mean in terms of, let's say, how much you focus on investigative reporting, or well above the mean, right? And so we do that for four indicators for public service information, public affairs focus, investigative reporting. So this is taking for each outlet the sample of stories that we drew, which was a constructed week, and about 50 to 100 stories for each outlet, hundreds to thousands of sources that are quoted, right? So so these are all article level measures. What is the type of news that they're producing, right? And then we also measured public service pluralism. This is where it's not article level. It's, for the most part, it's all the different kinds of sources that are mentioned, right? Categorized by, like, I think we had about 20 different categories that captured, labor, left political party, right political party. I think we actually had several nuances there. Business, local government, sort of religious groups, from capturing a diversity of types of sources. And we converted that into Herfindahl-Hirschman indexes, which is a way of capturing dispersion of different voices, right? So it's a way of capturing the diversity of voices. I can come back to this.
You mean it's named entity recognition of the content and then building an index?
The index is produced for each outlet. For, let's say, Le Monde, from the corpus of articles we looked at, had maybe 1,000 different persons quoted, and then we would categorize those according to types of sources, right? And then so let's say you had I don't know, the Wall Street Journal, maybe it's very business oriented, so 50% of the people quoted were business, and then very few of other types. So that would be actually pretty that would be considered less pluralist, because it's concentrated around a few dominant types of sources and not dispersed across a range of sources. Does that make sense? So we measured that both at institutional level, partisan, which we're looking at, far left to center left to across right. So we're looking at that way. And we looked at, these are sources mentioned, and this was the authors of the articles, capturing opinion pieces as well. Okay. So this is turned into the 1 to 4 scale. And so this shows public service information, the focus on public service information at different kinds of outlets. And what this shows is that civil society ownership, there's a statistical difference between that form of ownership and these other broad forms. Then what's interesting also when we break it down into these subforms, conglomerates, which could be private or market, among the lowest, maybe not surprising. Religious, which I mentioned, we only had a few in our sample, so I'd want to do a larger study to kind of replicate this. But they tended to be much more kind of focused on public service, according to these metrics. And then this was interesting. This kind of captures the current legacy journalistic control, which captures both an outlet like Mediapart, which is really founded by journalists, run by journalists, but also at Le Monde, where the journalists have a check on the owner power, right? So it would capture civil society as well as some private outlets as well. That also correlated with a greater focus on public service information. I don't show in this chart, but we also looked at funding, philanthropy, not surprisingly associated with very strong public service information. Now, public, partly because of the size of the sample alone, doesn't show a statistically significant difference. But I think one thing that I hope our study does, and I know I need to wrap up here soon, or
That's fine.
Okay.
Time.
Is public media, using these metrics is it's not better than Le Monde. It's not better than the New York Times, right? Especially when you've got large scale public media like in Sweden and in France. But so I think the fairer comparison, and this kind of gets back to what James Curran was talking about, the value of public media, and this is been a shortcoming in the US because it hasn't reached that level of reach, is that it provides quality, but it's also very accessible and it's reaching a broad audience. And so the interesting comparison is to compare it to other mass media. And so this compares public omnibus media. This would just be basically Sweden and France, compared to all non-public omnibus mass media, and all non-public omnibus legacy radio or TV. And there we see a significant difference. So it matters, right? It matters. And in an environment where more and more of the quality media is going behind a paywall, going behind a subscription wall, then public media stands out for providing, a strong focus on public affairs, public service information, and not being behind a paywall and reaching a larger audience. Yeah, this is just an image of Sweden, and Sweden has a particularly strong and it's investigative reporting too, as part of that. Public service pluralism. So this is looking at the range of voices I mentioned earlier. So this is looking at the kind of sources and the diversity there. Civil society again is highest. But we also see, it's interesting, the partisan affiliated, like the partisan foundations in Sweden I mentioned, or the partisan affiliated papers like Humanité in France, also are very high in pluralism, right? So that might be interesting because you might think, oh, they're going to be really one-sided. But in fact, using measures that look at a dispersion of sources, they actually provide a wider, partly maybe because they're just more interested in that ideological debate, right? So these kind of partisan affiliated owners can really add that to the discourse. Okay. Helen and Mancini, I'm throwing a lot at you here, but it's like, I just want to kind of get it out there and I can follow up on anything. Helen and Mancini talk about two kinds of pluralism. One is the internal pluralism of each news outlet, right? We expect when we read a news article or spend some time on a website that we're going to get a range of viewpoints, right? And they shouldn't just get one side. But another way of thinking about pluralism is, what is the pluralism across the whole media landscape, right? And so then we would say, are particular kinds of news outlets really bringing in voices that other outlets do not bring in? For instance, I believe labor unions, for instance, you read about in Humanité more than you would read in other newspapers. So we just looked at, these kind of more marginal groups, social movements, religious groups, labor unions, associations, other voices beyond the national government, and which outlets tended to bring that in to the public discourse. it again, civil society and to a certain extent, private. And the ones that were private often were these digital startups, and that was interesting. So Doggins, et cetera, in Sweden, Vice France, BuzzFeed, News, as I mentioned. So this is another way that to think about pluralism and a way that different ownership forms can help. Political instrumentalism. So do ownership forms differ in terms of the kind of partisan intensity or the partisan slant of the content they produce? We found that the highest intensity was also at civil society ownership, especially with partisan affiliated newspapers, media, and Swedish foundations. We also found that audience funding, so the kind of funding, so this kind of feeds into what some people are saying about if you have media that's supported by audiences, then there's an incentive to kind of pander to the kind of political preferences of that audience in a greater way than if you're have a different funding. So we do find that the intensity of the partisan slant, the kind of degree of slant was higher in audience subscriber funded than advertising funded media. And we also found that, and so this kind of begins to complicate Matthew Gensko's work, is that we find that, if there's any partisan leaning of both owners and audiences, as opposed to a more neutral or balanced attitude on the part of audiences or owners, that the partisan intensity tended to be higher, right? So the owners and audiences tended to move in the same direction. So, and not significantly differently. This shows the partisan favorability left to right. We found that stock market dominant shareholder owned media tended to be more right-leaning than other outlets, and this might capture what I talked about with the kind of amenity potential of that sort of ownership form, where if you are a dominant shareholder in a stock market traded company, then you have that potential and that incentive to kind of use your media outlet for a stronger political slant. And again, we found that both owner and audience preferences tended to influence news slant in the same direction. So this shows basically the news slant moving from left to right. And so as you move from left owners to right owners, it moves further right, right? And audiences moves further right. Basically moves in the same direction. It's closely aligned. Okay. And yeah, so just to wrap up then, economic instrumentalism is one we talk about a lot. We think about, especially right now in the US, are various owners using their media outlets to protect or promote their business interests. And especially when many of the owners are from Silicon Valley, telecom, from other major industries that are regulated or have contracts with the government, the incentive is there and the potential is certainly there. It's very difficult to document, right? Because it's something that if it happens, it's often going to happen in a kind of usually subtle way. Lately, it has not been happening in a subtle way in the United States, but usually I think it's something that it's kind of embarrassing for owners to get caught doing this. And so there's two broad ways I think we can think about, at least in terms of the news content. One is the news outlet being used to promote the owner's interests? So a very simple way would be, let's say, looking at Le Figaro's coverage, how do they cover Dassault's aviation industry, right? And so there have been some studies that show that, or just anecdotally, we can see that what is the coverage, how well, how much do they cover, and how positively do they cover their own kind of industrial interest. We tried to kind of capture this looking at ownership forms, and we see Le Figaro is actually among the highest here, which is, how often do they mention their ownership interests? So in this case, it would be Le Figaro. How often do they mention Dassault, right, in their coverage? And this was a smaller sample, but we did see that stock market traded companies and conglomerates, not surprisingly, with outside interests, tended to mention their ownership interest more often than other kinds of outlets. It's these mentions, this is an index, this is actually not an index, but a kind of raw scale that is actually magnified. So it's less than 1% of all the words. This was a separate corpus where we looked at all the words, all the kind of articles of a given outlet over like a 1.5 year period, right? So we're looking at a much larger sample and looking at all the words that were mentioned and how many of those words relate to the owners, right? So, but still, this is actually a very low percentage of coverage. But I think this was really telling when we were able to sort of, let's compare this to a separate sample we had of how do they cover business in general. And so, most media outlets cover business the same way they cover politics. They cover it critically. They're more critical than they're positive about business. But they're more on they're net favorable in the way they cover their owners, right? So I think that it really shows something important to say. Yeah, they don't mention them a lot, but when they do mention them, they tend to be more favorable than not. Whereas that they cover other businesses in a different way. And I think that's an important finding. So suppression, just to kind of wrap up with economic instrumentalism. Suppression is something very difficult to cover. We also did a qualitative sample where we looked at case studies and where we looked at scandals that emerged in the press in these countries over a 10-year period. And so this scandals involving owners where they have negative news about their interests and they suppress that. So this was a case where there was a documentary about LVMH, and in LVMH, Arnault owned outlets. There was very little coverage of this documentary, right, and much heavier coverage. And so I think this is a classic case of suppression. And I think we're beginning to see maybe a new kind of economic instrumentalism. We don't talk about this so much in the book, but maybe we'll call this capitulation, right, where you have a media outlet that is that has business before the government or is regulated by the government, and they back down because of that in the way they cover the government. Okay, so to sum up, this book tries to show how public service, political instrumentalism, and economic instrumentalism differ systematically by ownership forms and funding audience adjustment strategies. There are nuances there. If you read the book, you'll see that there are exceptions, and it's very complex, but there are, at a broad level, there are clear differences across these ownership forms, and I think that's an important finding. Public media are important. I want to stress this as a way to provide quality public service information to a broad public. And this book then is finally, I think, one of the first large-scale studies to really show that civil society ownership offers a valuable alternative to market and private ownership, especially if it can be scaled up. And so just to nuance this, is civil society ownership the answer? Is that what I'm saying? I think that this is just looking at US data. This is looking at total revenues. The largest, even NPR and PBS, which receive a lot of their money from philanthropy, they are very tiny operations compared to some of the major commercial media. So they're still very small. They need to be scaled up, and they tend to reach very elite audiences, even though they're not behind a paywall for the most part. They're not behind a paywall, right? So this is a huge problem. I think France maybe has some lessons for us, because some of the work Julia's been doing at Le Monde and others to set up these endowments. This is a kind of way to, I think, scale up civil society ownership. So civil society ownership is great, but we've got to make it bigger. We've got to find ways to fund it better. We've got to make it less elitist. Public, we've got to continue to try to fund it well and protect it from political pressure. Market ownership, maybe one message might be, why do we need stock market ownership? Maybe we hedge fund, And I guess the only thing I can think of is, well, maybe it's better than TikTok. I mean, at least it's still news. Some of it is, right? So, but to the extent that we do have market owners, we have to fight harder to stop these conflicts of interest or to make that more transparent, because that's a huge problem. And finally, private, we talk about benevolent billionaires in the US, and we've been very disappointed in recent years. I think in France, you don't have this illusion that they're benevolent. Maybe at Le Monde. But yeah, if they're so benevolent, why don't they all just do what Xavier Niel did at Le Monde? Why don't we convert a lot of these private owned media, like at the Washington Post, to various kinds of endowment or trust ownership, like at the Guardian or at Le Monde? And that would be a way to kind of bring in civil society logic to commercial media. And if that's not possible, then to really fight for these non-ownership mechanisms of control, like the Readers Association, the Journalists Association at Le Monde, where they can check the owner power. And that is it. Okay, thank you.
You, Rod. So like now we'll have Anya connected. Anya, can you hear us and can you see as well?
Yeah,
Maybe.
everything's perfect. Mm-hmm. Great. Do you want me to start talking or are you going to say something?
Yes, no, I'm just gonna tell everyone that after your intervention, we'll have the Q&A session. We have about like 30 people connected online. So people that are connected online can just raise your hands and we'll let you speak. Or you can also write down your questions in the Q&A and we'll let you just answer them. So Anya, the floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I'm so sorry to be the annoying person on Zoom. I was actually in Frankfurt yesterday, and if I had been thinking, I would have come through Paris to be with all of you in person. So really apologies, because I know everybody hates that speaker on Zoom. But yeah, really glad to be here. I was so excited by this book. You know, we'd all been waiting for years for Rodney and his co-authors to publish it. And when it came out this summer, well, actually, Rodney was kind enough to invite me on a panel in the spring. And then I read it twice and wrote a review and did the Q&A because I just thought it was really, really important. First of all, I think that to the field, it makes a major contribution. Rodney mentioned the Ellie Gnome work, and then of course you have a lot of papers. You have some papers from the 1990s that look at media ownership. But I think what was so important about this paper was that it didn't just collect a lot of data, but it actually drew conclusions and found patterns in the data. Because if you have 12 volumes of data, then really it doesn't help you very much. And I know this is often a conversation among economists about, is theory important or is data important? And I think that, I know Julie and I have even had these conversations as well over dinner. But I just think that raw data without some kind of guidance is just not, you know, what do you do with it really? So I think that's a major contribution. I think that this is a moment where all of this really, really matters. And I've been amazed, you know, work that all of us have been thinking about media capture for a very long time. Obviously, the economists were really the ones who started looking at this, you know, about 15 years ago. And in the world of communications and journalism, when we brought it up, people sort of said, well, why are you bothering us? We read Chomsky, we read Ben Bangdickian, you know, we kind of, there's nothing else to say. And now, of course, because of what's happening in the US, and all the self-censorship and Jeff Bezos and the LA Times and Elon Musk. And it turns out that capture is a problem, not just for media outlets, but also social media platforms. All of a sudden, people really care about media capture. And so this, you know, discussion of ownership and the qualifying nuance that it's not just ownership, but what logic does the ownership have in terms of business models, I think is really, really, really important. And of course, I had to laugh about the 15% return because when my dad lost his job in book publishing, that was what Studs Terkel and my dad and everybody said to Cy Newhouse, the newspaper owner, which is, if you want a 15% return, please don't buy a book publisher, go buy a soap factory or something else. So now here we are, you know, 40 years later, having that exact discussion. So, so I think that, I think the capture, I think the fact that there's sort of conclusions to be drawn from the work makes, adds to why it's so relevant. I'm going to be very interested to see the reaction that Rod gets in the US, because so much of the US effort to save journalism has been about philanthropic funding. And I don't know whether for a European audience, your points about what this does to audience, I don't know if that lands in Paris the way it lands in New York, but your point is really, really important, that basically the foundations are kind of at fault because they pushed, their whole idea was that one day journalism will transition to a market model, and their job is just to fund it for a couple of years. And so what that meant, Rod, is pretty clear, is that the small nonprofits really, really pushed a model that meant middle-class readers or upper middle-class readers who would make donations. So that's kind of a damnation of the philanthropic model. And then your other point, that the obsession with impact led also to targeting elite audiences, because it's the elites that could make a difference. So I think those were points I hadn't really thought about. And I think that I'm very curious to know sort of what your US readers or scholars are going to say about that, because that may annoy a lot of people, and I'll be interested to hear kind of where that goes. And especially this, yeah, I think it's telling, because what you're really saying is that we have to accept the fact that these outlets aren't eventually going to make it financially. We need another model. And I was just at a breakfast the other day, and I heard the head of Open Society Foundation, Benaifer, say that the reason they closed their journalism program, they had been putting $10 to $20 million a year into journalism, was because they concluded that the outlets they were supporting didn't have a large enough reach. I think the people who worked at the program would dispute that, but that's significant. And I definitely always felt in the US that that philanthropists were sort of guilty of encouraging too many startups, because there were so many markets, and Julia would know this really well, like in small countries, poor countries in Africa, low income, where you simply can't support a lot of small outlets, or you can, but they're going to stay small. So obviously, if you're giving advice to philanthropists, Rod, I'd be very interested in hearing what you have to say. I'm hoping that you're going to come to Saving Journalism on March 20th in Paris, and everybody in this room is, of course, invited. And I'm really hoping, Rod, that you'll be able to talk more about some of the solutions for all of this. You sort of touch on it at the end, where you talk about some of the readers' councils and some of the things that Julia has helped bring into Le Monde. So I'm really eager to learn more about that, and how effective they are, or whether it's the usual. We see all the problems in our system in the US, and we think that everybody else, the grass is always greener, has found real solutions. But I love that point that you made, that actually there are things that can be fixed. I know my dad used to say that about French medical care, that there's all these problems we have in the US that actually you can fix overseas. So I think those are some of my main points. I guess in terms of the world, I'll just wrap up by saying it really feels like everything is going to get worse rather than better. We've seen in the US that post the second Trump election, we haven't seen the Trump bump. So, Washington Post, New York Times got a bit more subscriptions, but nothing like last year. Last time, I feel like we're moving to where the polarization is so extraordinary now, really across the world. And I think that your points about public broadcasters and how they really have a role to play in reaching large audiences, I think that's really interesting. And I think the other terrible development is that we've really learned where the social media platforms stand. For a while, they were sort of pretending to be independent arbiters, and now they've all come out. as complete opportunists who are giving money to Trump, going and have dinner with him. So I'd say the only flaw in your book, Rod, and that's not your fault, is you looked at three democracies. But where we're going isn't that. So and certainly not in the US. So I'll be really interested in hearing how you update. So I'll conclude here, but as you can tell, I've read the book carefully. I think it's a very important book. I think you've raised a lot of new ideas, and I'm just so happy for you and your co-authors that you're out talking about those ideas after so many years of work. And obviously so happy I introduced you to Julia, who introduced me to Felipe, who I now work with, who put this together. And just so looking forward to the next time I'm in Paris and I can be with you all in person. I'll mute now and hear some responses and questions.
Nice, thank you so much, Anya. So Rodney, do you want to maybe reply a bit to that, or should we move to the Q&A?
Maybe one thing, no, I don't know. Maybe I think she said it all. I don't know. I don't know what I would add to it. I agree with everything she said, and it's what are the solutions? I'm not sure, but I think there's no one solution. Definitely, there's not one solution, right? I think you need a mixed model, and all of these are going to be important. But I think the bigger thing is scaling up, and to the point about are people sensitive to this critique? I think they're making that critique of themselves right now. There was one, when you talked about this, there was the Institute for Nonprofit News, which is the big association for maybe 250 or 300 of these nonprofits in the US. The president's last speech to the association was, we've got to scale up. We've got to scale up. We've got to reach a bigger audience. We've got to start caring about reaching people at scale. So I think that is I won't take credit for, I think a lot of people have been moving in this direction and think this is too small bore. We great work, but if no one reads it, what difference does it make? But the problem, the things you pointed to at the end, and that does go beyond this book, but it's one thing I want to pay attention going forward is, it's not just a problem of different types of news media. It's news media against everything else that people can be spending their time with. And so how can, whether it's commercial media or public media, how can it bring back younger readers and people who have just tuned out, or like the taxi driver that brought me over that was politics is all dirty, and it's just like they're just cynical and turned off if they're not radicalized by what's going on.
So I have like a 100 questions. So I'm just going to ask one at the end of the day, which is, what is the next research step? Where are we in terms of frontier? In a sense, perhaps this is your last point. We are still like a little bit lost about like what is the optimal media ownership structure, but it's kind of too late. We need to move from that to social media. So what is next that we should tackle in a sense?
So I think ownership, funding, and audiences are relevant to other kinds of media, political media. So yeah, that is my next passion, and I'm trying to bring it down to size. But I mean, the model for me is a book by Bruce Williams and Michael Della Carpini. Michael Della Carpini they're both political scientists. Michael Della Carpini was the dean at the Annenberg School at Penn for a long time. And they wrote a book called After Broadcast News in 2011, which is basically saying and by broadcast news, they meant the mass media model, which is falling apart now, right? The legacy TV, even the cable, the big newspapers, it's falling apart. The distinction between professional journalism and other forms of political information, between entertainment, advertising, activism is breaking down. A lot of people this was just starting. I mean, they could hardly even see how far it was going to go in 2011, right? But their point is like, don't get so hung up on like saving journalism. Is that the only thing? Sure, I think journalism is valuable and it's got to be part of the ecosystem. But other kinds of information producers could produce quality work, right? Filmmakers, documentary makers, political influencers, podcasters. So I think, and so they said, we need to think about normative standards that transcend genres. Is it politically relevant? Does it model civic practice? Does it provide a pluralism of voices? They use the word verisimilitude. Is it true in the way that's appropriate to the genre? It may not be factual truth in a work of fiction, but it might be true in some larger sense. So I'd like to take that and sort of like look beyond journalism, but then take that political economy approach to who's doing good work broadly, thinking more broadly about what is good work. But and then I think you might, Wikipedia has a nonprofit structure. It's not perfect, right? But it's doing different kinds of work than X, and the way X changed when it went private. So I think you could take all these kinds of platforms and these podcasting companies or whatever and say, like, who's behind them, and not just individually, but like, what's the structure there? I think.
Yeah, very good. But anyone has any other questions?
I have a question about the point that you made about the publishers caring about the audience, because they were saying that they listen to the audience primarily and so on and so on. I was wondering, how do they actually do this? Like, how do they actually care about the audience? What's the mechanism by which they find out what the audience wants to hear? And might it not just be a very good selling point that they just say we really care about it, but actually we as journalists are much smarter than the audience, and so we will tell you exactly what you need to hear. Like, I'm just curious, like, how did they prove that they care about the
So there's a mix of it. I mean, so they've got surveys, they've got things like Chartbeat, they've got real-time kind of ways of seeing who's reading, what on their websites, right? So they've got ways of kind of tracking, audience interest. And yeah, go ahead, Anya.
Oh, sure. I mean, I have a friend whose full-time job is user experience at the New York Times. So they're going around interviewing people all the time saying, which game would you like to play? What are you looking at? They do one-on-one focus groups. And as Rod pointed out, there's sort of an industry in America of, at the top level, the sort of Disney's or the Washington Post or the New York Times, they have entire teams that are working on this. I did a report years ago called Bridging the Gap, where I talked to the small nonprofits about how they engage with audiences. So there's, as you know, I think there's a lot of this in Europe too, membership model, come and meet the editor and have a little wine and cheese, come to our newsroom and tell us what you think. We'll come out to your community. I'm probably more familiar with the efforts in the US, but Documented, New York Focus, the fact-checking groups are all on WhatsApp all the time with their audiences, trying to find out, what it is that they want, as well as looking at the analytics. This morning, I was just finishing my newsletter to my students, and I check all of the clicking. Are the alumni clicking? Are the students clicking? Who's opening? What are they looking at? So we do have and that's just me and my student newsletter, so I think we have tons and tons of data, and then tons and tons of efforts. And then, as you point out, people that are trying to make money off of this. So I think audience is kind of the new mantra in a way.
I may disagree, but I do not completely disagree, but I do agree with what you said, and I think this is maybe one of the big problems, because we just focus on an existing audience and we try to please them. And the big issue for me is the audience that is not there. So the young and the less educated, and by asking the existing audience, what do you want to eat? Basically, we're just feeding them and like completely forgetting those that don't like the plate. And this is where the frontier is, even for existing media outlets. And they're spending too much time trying to understand their own audience, while they should try to understand the audience they do not have. But perhaps you, yeah. It's your thought.
No. That's this is all interesting, and the I mean, the kind of market pressure is driving this. So the one example I can think of where they are interested in an audience they don't have is they want subscribers, right? And so they'll do tests. They'll sort of say, what do what kind of content gets people to convert to subscription. And then they use that kind of data to try to get more subscribers. So they do see a distinction between the non-subscriber audience and the subscriber audience, and increasingly they want the subscriber audience because that's where they're getting more. I saw an article about Le Monde. They're saying they've moved in that way. So I mean, this has been a good thing in some ways, but it's also moved the content behind the paywall. And in terms of democracy and authoritarianism, I've been thinking about what's going on in the US, and I think Trump has gone after the big media that's actually, a lot of it's still reaching people relatively free. And he's trying to cow that media. And he can't have the same effect over the critical media like the New York Times that's behind a paywall. But more and more of this stuff, it's behind a paywall, right? So in a way, it's like there's all kinds of critical media, but it's a community of critics speaking to themselves, right? And so that's a huge issue civically.
Yeah, so we just have one more question online, and then we're wrapping this up. So Matthias will allow you to speak, and you can make the question to the speaker.
Matthias Hesser is one of my co-authors.
Hello,
Yes.
can you hear me? Is it camera as well, or is you only hear my voice?
We see your voice, we don't see you.
See if you can put me on screen. I'm happy with that. Otherwise, I can just speak.
Can you turn on your camera?
Yeah. Yeah, otherwise I guess we can hear you well,
Sure,
Matthias.
otherwise, that's all absolutely fine.
Thank you.
Not much to see. So I just want to comment on, first of all, thank you, Rod, for a great presentation. It's fun to see it this way as well, when you've been in the book for so long. So I would like to comment on when we talked about audiences and tracking who's reading what, etc. So if you go to the newsroom of the Wall Street Journal, you will see a giant screen where they have an audience number that turns red when you go down in traffic from where they're supposed to be. That tells you everything, how it sort of tracked on a second by second basis, and then everyone is watching that. And also newsrooms nowadays are very different from, I'm an historian, what newsroom used to be like in the past, where they were known for being noisy and people were screaming and they ran around with news stories. It's completely silent, and everyone is just working together to make sure that you have the right type of traffic. Newspapers have always been extraordinarily interested in their audiences, even in the past, but they used to use surveys. An interesting example, and I take the Swedish example here, Svenska Dagbladet, this is part of our study, is that back in the day they used surveys to see what did people want to read. The funny thing we know now is they were never honest, because they have an idealized view of themselves, so they tend to focus on the high quality stuff. So they wanted like the very interesting long essays. They would tell the survey that I read that every day, or the good opinion pieces, etc., etc. With digital, when you start to track, you realize that actually has very low traffic, and then automatically these newspapers have then been going more and more in that direction because you need to keep traffic up. My suggestion is actually to not see it as that they were lying, but that was actually what they wanted. They believed that a newspaper should carry this kind of material, even if you didn't read it every day. So they meant it in the sense that they wanted quality news. And we have to navigate that as well, that there's actually a lot of demand for quality news in society, even though that not all of the time will translate into high traffic. So that's my point.
Interesting. Thanks, Matthias.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Matthias, and thank you for everyone online. Unfortunately, we won't have any more time for questions, but we appreciate
They will be able to ask questions like during the drinks.
Yes,
exactly. But for those who are in person, you can still make questions to Rodney over drinks. And thank you so much for everyone who joined us online. Thank you, Anya, for being here. Thank you, Rodney. Thank you, Julia. Thank you for Ria and Jamila as well for organizing that. Thank you all.